Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Shelton. We're continuing here with Energy 101, and today we're going to talk about a topic that is in the press a lot. It particularly gets in the press in the political season, but energy independence. Energy independence has been discussed, and every president since President Nixon in the U.S. has declared that they want to make the U.S. energy independent. And unfortunately, by almost any way you want to measure it, we haven't made any significant headway in that direction, even though it's stated to be a high priority. So what do we mean by energy independence? What is it? That's one of the big problems. Is you can define it in many ways. Is energy independence just crude oil? Or we consider only crude oil and look at what percent of our crude oil we import? Or do we assume oil and natural gas liquids, as we talked about last time, which are classified as petroleum? Do we talk about petroleum as a whole, and by adding oil and natural gas liquids together, and look at what percent of those quantities do we import? Or in some cases, people have even shown numbers adding and making equivalent oil, petroleum, gas, natural gas, and coal. So there's a lot of ways you can assume it. The definition of independence and dependence. So we'll look at some of those today, but this is part one of a two-part section I'll do on energy independence, and what does it mean, and what do we have to do to get there. So first, let's look at them individually, so we won't get buried in the weeds so quickly. Let's look at the individual different fuels, because all fuels are not created equal. Look, starting at the bottom, if you look at crude oil, this is the bar chart, and first along the x-axis, these are horizontal bars, and the bar is length. It indicates the energy that we get from each of those fuels. Crude oil is on the bottom, and we see that we use that much energy, which is about 35 giga-BTUs, or quad sometimes it's called. What we mean by giga is 10 to the 15th. 10 to the 15th BTUs is 1 giga-BTU, or quad sometimes it's called. But we use 35 giga-BTUs in a year. This was for 2011. And the red part shows what percent of that is imported, and the blue part what we produce. And so you can see that we import more than we produce, just plain crude oil. And let's get our terminology straight here. Crude oil is the same as oil, and sometimes, but I'd like to add crude to it when I can to specify that we really are talking about oil as it comes out of the ground, and versus oil that's motor oil for lubrication and some of those other uses for oil by itself that we refer to as oil, even though we've refined it. Let's move up one then and look at natural gas. As we looked at these fuels before, we saw that most of the natural gas we produce, we only import about 15%, and that's shown as about 25 giga-BTUs total, and about 15% of that we import. And we noted before that most of that import right there comes from Canada, and we feel a little more comfortable about importing from Canada from a security viewpoint, but it still has an economic impact. That's money that's flowing out of this country that, if it were in this country, could create jobs and create infrastructure and create add a lot to our economy. But our total use, as we saw before, for natural gas in energy units is less than oil. It's down about 25. Next, we talked about natural gas liquids. And natural gas liquids, remember, are the liquids that can be separated from the natural gas by pressurizing them, the gas, and liquefying, such as propane and butane. So the natural gas liquids are down around 4 gigabTUs, or 4 quads. And essentially all of that is we produce ourselves. We import a negligible amount. There is a sliver of red right here if you look at it very closely. And then we have coal. Coal is the only fuel that in any significant quantity at all we export. And here the red part of the bar is over on the left-hand side and is a negative number. So rather than import it, we are exporting that much coal. And the total coal that we use then is the blue, and we produce that ourselves, and we produce about 21 gigabTUs. But that is not a fuel that we worry about from an energy independence, because we actually are exporting a little bit. China is buying more and more coal from us, which the coal community obviously likes, in the coal industry, because of the jobs and the economy, the economic growth that it brings. That counters a little bit some of the decrease in coal production and coal use because of global warming and other environmental issues. Renewable energy, and the renewable energy is one that includes a lot of different things. The biggest one being hydroelectricity, but it also includes ethanol, which we talked about last time, I believe, and wind energy, solar energy, which is really a negligible amount. But ethanol and biomass is what ethanol gets classified as, and hydro from dams, hydroelectricity. So that's renewables. And so when we add all those up and say, well, of our total energy that we use, which is about 120 gigabTUs, 120 gigabTUs is what we use. If you sum all of these up, all of these 5 different fuel resources or energy resources that we use in order to supply the energy that we want daily to drive our cars and to heat our homes, etc., then we come up with 120, and you can see there's a smaller percentage here, because obviously we're adding fuels, most of which we produce here at home, to the crude oil. So that brings the fraction that we are importing of our total energy. But that's very misleading, because that's assuming all fuels can be treated equally. And as I've already mentioned, all energy is not created equal. That's the first way you know that is crude oil is about $16 a million BTUs, and natural gas is about $3 or $4 a million BTUs. So why would anybody use oil at all if they were equivalent? We just use natural gas. But in fact, there's some characteristics that prevent us from doing that. So why are we so interested in oil? Well, you've seen this chart before briefly, but I just want to point it out again, is that the problem is that our transportation system is driven by oil, and that is a issue, and one, but because all this is oil, everything except ethanol, which is a renewable biomass. And why are we running our transportation system on oil rather than other cheaper fuels and fuels that we produce here at home? Well, it has to do with the characteristics of the fuel and converting that fuel into the type of energy form that our society wants. So that's the reason for the focus on oil. And as you've already seen, we import about 60% of our oil if we just consider crude oil only. However, about a third of that oil, as we saw, comes from Canada that we're less worried about. From a trend viewpoint, we've seen this, but when we looked at the import module, it is coming down some. We were at about 65%, and now we're at about 60%. So there's a small trend there in the last 3 or 4 years that's bringing down our percent of oil imports. And you can see there have been some other periods that have the same thing has happened out here. And we can talk about that later, but there's good reasons why they went down when they did. So that's the trend, and the oil imports that we've already mentioned, most of them come from, not most of them, but our biggest importer is Canada and Mexico, and they're from North America. So that's some of the topics on from the big picture on energy independence, and we'll talk about it in more detail in part 2 next time. Thank you.